I am very, very pleased to introduce you to our keynote speaker today, who will be Scott Appleby. He is a professor of history and the Marilyn Keough Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. And prior to this, he was the director of Notre Dame's Kushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism and the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. He's well known to most of us here because of Notre Dame's extensive exchange programs with the Ukrainian Catholic University. But others perhaps might know Scott through his many writings on how religion and modern ideas have intersected so as to mutually shape institutions, practices, and above all, conflicts. Among his many publications, I cite several award-winning ones that are among my favorites. I mentioned the Ambivalence of the Sacred, Religion, Violence, and Reconciliation, as well as the Oxford Handbook of Religion, Conflict, and Peacebuilding, and also the very, very impressive 5-volume collection that Scott edited together with Martin Marty of the University of Chicago, entitled The Fundamentalism Project. I think all of those publications are very, very germane to the study of religion in Ukraine. The topic of his presentation this evening is Making War and Building Peace, the crucial role of religious actors. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to R. Scott Appleby.
Thank you, Kathy. I want to thank Kathy Warner, Heather Coleman, and the other organizers of this conference for including me on the agenda. It was a bold and perhaps questionable decision, as I am an expert neither on Ukraine or Russia or on Eastern Orthodox Christianity. What were they thinking? You must be wondering. Well, let's see. I take as my assignment the attempt to situate the current war and the conflicts between the various religious bodies and between religion and state in a broader context, namely patterns of religious agency and religious involvement in numerous deadly conflicts over the last several decades in various cases across the world. The hope is that some of these patterns might illuminate elements of the current situation in Ukraine. A key to my analysis is an assumption that religions have been profoundly affected and in many cases transformed by late modernity, that is, the distinctive constellation of structural and social conditions that are now inarguably global. To name the most obvious of these conditions relevant to my purposes in this talk is the technologically driven communications revolution, enabling almost everyone to selectively retrieve and manipulate the reporting of events, facts, trends, data, history, and the like, and to disseminate the resulting information, opinion, propaganda instantaneously. The Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman described this era, our era of late modernity, as more than a latter-day version of the conditions of the techno-scientific modernity which reigned in the global capitalist economies of the 20th century, as more than merely the acceleration of those processes of instantaneous communication across once immutable boundaries of time and space. Rather, Bauman claims that traits and social roles, which in previous generations were assigned to individuals by the community, are now self-assigned individually and can be changed at will, thereby abetting conditions and context of unprecedented fluidity and unpredictability. As a result, people feel secure about their identities and their places in society and history, and they feel anxious and distrustful about whether their self-proclaimed traits are being respected. Society as a whole, Bauman notes, quote, feels more chaotic. Indeed, late or liquid modernity shapes religions and religious communities no less than it does other social groups and organizations, but perhaps a bit differently, and that religions everywhere are reinventing themselves in multiple ways, not least as transnational, transborder, trans-ethnic global communities, even those communities which have always been transnational, have emphasized their transnational identity in the context of late modernity and what that might mean for religious identity across the board and in any particular community. The Russian Orthodox Church, for example, defines the geographic extent of its canonical territory, as you know, as including all the territory within China, Japan, and the post-Soviet states, excluding Armenia and Georgia. Its statutes define its sphere of jurisdiction as including, quote, also Eastern Orthodox Christians living in other countries outside of its canonical territory. Of course, the geographical extent of the canonical territory defined by the Russian Orthodox Church is disputed by other Eastern Orthodox churches. Nonetheless, the emphasis of churches increasingly is on their global transnational character. Religions are also reinterpreting the meaning of once stable and fundamental beliefs, practices, markers of identity. Fundamental identity markers such as tradition, sovereignty, sacred space, and belonging are now destabilized and fluid. And global religions, which include within themselves a dizzying variety of regional and local religious movements, communities, sects, and cadres, are moving with late modernity speed to remake themselves within the context of what the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor calls a secular age, an era characterized by life lived within, quote, the immanent frame. I have to pause and say, it's difficult giving a talk online to an audience whom I do not know personally. You all may be Taylor aficionados and know more about his massive corpus than I do, or it may be a new name for you. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm telling you things you already know. But Taylor's notion of life in our secular late modern age is a life lived within his phrase, an immanent frame, according to which once supernatural or otherworldly imaginaries are conceived almost exclusively within the mundane parameters of time and space. This is a Procrustean arrangement which yields a variety of secular as well as religious modalities. Within this immanent frame, religious leaders who have allowed themselves to become captive to state or government imperatives. They invoke God or the Holy Land, heaven and hell, divine retribution, or blessing. But these commonplace religious tropes are prioritized within mundane political considerations. This is very much in keeping with the immanent frame and in keeping with the conditions of many religions around the world whose alliance with or opposition to the all-powerful state defines who they are increasingly. While, as I'll mention, there are all kinds of references to heaven or hell, to God or the devil, to the cosmos, they are all, in a kind of Procrustean sense, fit within a very mundane political calculation. That is the tendency that Taylor prepares us for. And there is more. The splintering of religious communities, which seems to be in contradiction or in tension with the global comprehensive view of some of these communities, they're nonetheless splintering at the same time. The splintering reflects a fundamental religious ambivalence about violence and its legitimacy as an instrument of obedience to a mundane cause, even a cause understood to be just. So there is struggle within this immanent frame, within these mundane political calculations about the role of violence and the power of religion to make violence a particularly excessive and sustained reaction. On the one hand, in this situation, some religious leaders, communities, organizations, including political parties and social movements, inspired by religiously sanctioned irredentism, revanchism, ethno-nationalism, or dreams of global rebellion. Some of them sow discord and division. These religious actors around the world are putatively willing to have on their hands the blood of the ethnic, religious, or ideological other. Given that religious extremism in this late modern fluid mode has been on the rise globally for over 50 years now, and we can talk about when we start counting, but certainly for at least the last 5 decades. We cannot speak of a spike in religiously legitimated violence in our day, but rather we speak of the deepening and geographical expansion of such violence, a trend which is attaining the status of normalcy. Sadly, religious violence no longer surprises. Hamas's horrific attacks on Israeli Jews, Jewish settler violence against Palestinians living peacefully in the West Bank, Hindu nationalists justifying pogroms against Muslim minorities, Christian evangelicals in the United States lobbying for state-supported violence in Gaza, Ugandan Christians lobbying for state-sanctioned violence against LGBTQ individuals, Sinhalese Buddhist monks demonizing their Tamil enemies as a prelude to their extermination by the Sri Lankan military. The list of religiously stoked atrocities over the past decades can go on and on. But this is not the whole story. Ambivalence about violence, ambivalence about religious roles in a mundane framework, but in interaction with the sacred, that kind of destabilizing moment cuts both ways. From the time of the world wars of the 20th century to the present day, we have also seen the emergence of a countervailing religious force, namely the rise and increasing sophistication of religiously inspired or inflected movements and organizations for nonviolent resolution and transformation of conflict. Indeed, religious actors and organizations and movements from several traditions, Christianity and all its branches, Judaism and Islam, Buddhisms and Hinduisms, and indigenous groups are engaged separately or collaboratively in the practices of religious peace building. That is, in intentional, organized interventions in conflict settings, which span the arc from education for peace, early warning of violent conflict coming, dialogue across ethnic and religious boundaries, to active real-time conflict prevention, negotiation, and mediation, to the monitoring of peace processes and ceasefires, to post-accord participation in the reintegration of combatants, judicial reform, the rebuilding of civil society, and practices of forgiveness and reconciliation. As I'll say in a moment, religious actors are not alone in this range of professional peace-building practices, but their skill, their training, their education in these practices has increased over the years so that we can now point to a range of religious actors who work in teams, who work with professionals at various points of violent conflict to build peace along that arc of conflict and post-conflict settlement. So, little theoretical part here is coming to an end, but late modernity, to sum up, in other words, this period in which we live, has set into motion multivalent and often seemingly contradictory processes in the sphere of conflict, no less than in international trade, international relations, global social dynamics, and cross-cultural hybridization. These historical dynamics inform the multiple roles of religious actors in deadly conflict and the ambivalence toward violence and toward peace that characterizes world religions today. On the one hand, broadly speaking, the sacralization of the modern nation state has led to the irredentist and expansionist violence we see frequently now. On the other hand, modernity has also unleashed transnational energies as well as subnational rebel, secessionist, or human rights groups that challenge the state or state-sanctioned established religions and their claimed monopoly over legitimate violence in the defense of claims to territorial integrity and empire. These claims are increasingly disputed within religious communities by co-religionists, and they're sometimes violently disputed. This range of public expressions of religion in the late modern world are seldom, if ever, purely religious, however, as if modern religious actors could isolate themselves from the fluid, dynamic co-imbrication of the worldly and the otherworldly, the mundane and the metaphysical, which characterizes our secular but also simultaneously post-secular age. We moderns all live to one degree or another within Taylor's eminent frame. That said, it remains true that competing accounts of what constitutes the sacred sovereign or the Holy Land or a righteous, divinely ordained cause, that these competing accounts define what is at stake in many of the wars in the world today that involve a significant religious element or that invoke religion as a multiplying or strengthening force for conflicts that are primarily or exclusively territorial or economic. The two of the most significant wars roiling the world today, in Israel-Palestine and in Russia-Ukraine, I would argue, are conflicts that are clearly have a strong religious component that has really taken a conflict that could have otherwise and historically was otherwise territorial, political, economic, into a deep abyss at times of the religious imagination. So this has been a very broad account of late 20th, early 21st century global religious dynamics. There's much more, of course, we could say. We could talk about that all day. But I would imagine that this broad account will sound familiar to you experts who are convening these days to discuss Ukraine's vulnerability to the religious and political and transnational currents that seem to be setting the course of the nation's future. The big question for non-specialists, those watching, was Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the onset of what might be described as a holy war. The sociologist of religion, Jose Casanova, whom I'm sure is familiar to you and has probably been invoked in your conference so far, Jose would place such a question, as some of you would know, in the context of what he calls the sacralization of territorial canonicity as the legitimation of violence. The sacralization of territorial canonicity as the legitimation of violence. By territorial canonicity, flipping that term a bit, he means the religious claim that Holy Rus, aka the Greater Russia or the Russian world, is the expanse of territory which in itself constitutes the sacred rule, law, text, people. The canonical territory, as defined by the Patriarch of Moscow, is the lens through which rule, law, text, and imperial claims must be read. In this case, one political sovereign, Putin, and one religious sovereign, Kirill, are to unite and rule the lands under the spiritual authority of the one true religion. How neat and tidy. However, Moscow's religiously sanctioned irredentism, or Holy Land grab, recalls Milosevic's ambition to reclaim the Greater Serbia from Bosnian ethnic and religious others in the Balkans in the 1990s, an ambition that was sanctified by Serbian Orthodox clerics subservient to the state. And of course, this kind of religiously sanctioned land grab or irredentism finds echoes in the claim of Jewish irredentists that the Zionist state should extend and does extend from the Nile to the Jordan. That is, it's a state that should encompass Eretz Israel, the whole land of Israel, which according to the Torah is bequeathed by God to the Jewish people. Jewish religious nationalists including leaders of the settler movement occupying the West Bank of the Jordan in violation of international law, and who are critical members of Netanyahu's ruling coalition, they have messianic dreams of dominating this expanse of territory, which corresponds approximately not only to modern-day Israel, Palestine, but Jordan, parts of southern Lebanon, southern Syria, and beyond. This is their holy land, their holy Rus. Fortunately, however, hegemonic religious forces, whether nationalist or imperialist in orientation, whether in Russia or Israel or India, these forces do not go uncontested. These and other civilizational religions are internally plural. This is a commonplace, as it were, or obvious, but it's worth reflection what that means. That these civilizational religions are internally plural, fiercely so, under the centrifugal forces of late modernity, which I sketched earlier. That is to say, these religions are marked by contesting interpretations, claims, authorities, and fundamentals, disputes raging within each multi-generational and transnational religious community. Eastern Orthodox Christianity, of course, is a five-star example of the benefits, as it were, of internal pluralism. Here, speak of the benefits. A long-simmering tension, this is the story we're all familiar with, the long-simmering tension between pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian Christians, which came to a head in 2019, shortly after Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I announced that he was bestowing the status of autocephaly on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and revoked the binding letter of 1686. That decision, once announced, Putin called a meeting of the Russian National Security Council, as you know. From that moment, Casanova writes, it was very clear that the war was going to happen sooner or later. The Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, who is acknowledged as the primus inter pares among the autocephalous churches of the Eastern Orthodox Church, has repeatedly condemned Russian aggression, but his proclamation was seen and understood by Putin and by the Moscow Patriarch as itself an act of belligerence, an act of war against this imagined greater Russia, this holy Russia that includes territories that I mentioned earlier. In this pattern of religious contestation, and we could talk the rest of this time just about the contestation within Orthodoxy in Russia and Ukraine and the intervention of the state and so on. But again, my assumption is this would bore you since you know it better than I. But I will say that this kind of pattern of religious contestation is Eastern Orthodoxy is not alone. Part of my motif here is you are not alone. While the situation in Ukraine and in the Russian-Ukraine conflict is distinctive in multiple ways, and we don't want to conflate the particulars because the devil and the angel is in the details in every one of these conflicts. At the same time, it is striking how some of the patterns that we see in Ukraine and Russia are very familiar to those of us who have been studying religious aggression and religious peace building for several decades now. Branches of virtually all world religions are practicing selective, politically motivated retrievals of doctrines, rituals, precepts, authorizations from what is, after all, a vast and internally contradictory history of texts, sacred texts, councils, exegesis, disputes over ecclesiastical jurisdiction, such as autocephaly. Virtually all civilizational religious communities are tempted to react excessively against what they increasingly perceive as the marginalization of their once dominant, defining role in culture and society. They feel marginalized either by secular elites or by rebellious co-religionists, or by West-toxicated, the phrase of an Iranian intellectual in the 70s, that we are becoming West-toxicated, both intoxicated and poisoned by the decadent West. So West-toxicated agents of materialism might be those who are marginalizing the holy religion, or, as the Moscow patriarch claims, bisexual libertines, not least liberated women and now prominent gay and lesbian cultural influencers. The culprits differ from time to time and from society to society, but there is always a categorical role for them to play. Besieged religious communities are communities that feel themselves to be besieged. These may be two different things, but besieged religious communities and offices everywhere are increasingly tempted to embrace a strict dualism, which separates the world into the elect and the reprobate, the saved and the damned. Increasingly, they are all tempted to turn apocalyptic, a move which, set within the eminent this worldly frame of late modernity, is politically functional. By this I mean that end times or apocalyptic ravings about, say, the satanic West, the end of time, the darkness of the apocalypse, are politically functional, and that they can serve to justify deadly violence that is not otherwise authorized in sacred scripture or tradition. What I call emergency clauses can be teased out of most sacred scriptures and councils. That is, a passage, a surah, a single quote from a religious authority, which amounts to a footnote within the vast corpus, but which gives the nod to retaliatory, deadly violence. Only in case of emergencies, such as the arrival of the Antichrist, can ordinary constraints on violence be eased. And so they must. Killing becomes a sacred obligation in such imagining. So the Granth Sahib, the sacred book of the Sikhs, is all about forgiveness and reconciliation and peace. There is a particular saying of one of the gurus that in the case in which the life of Sikhism itself is mortally threatened by enemies, we must no longer be peaceful and nonviolent. We are obligated to take up the sword. This is what I refer to as the emergency clause. Normally, we don't bomb, we don't rape, we don't justify kidnapping, and so on. But in these times, heaven and earth are colliding. The apocalypse is upon us, and our sacred tradition has warned us about this moment. And so let's loosen the constraints on religious violence. This is important rhetorically for the recruiting effort of militias, religiously backed militias, or subgroups that are willing to do violence or to give a blessing to it, because ordinary believers, at least those who are somewhat educated in their tradition, recognize that the killing of innocents is forbidden frequently in the sacred text and tradition. So how can it be justified now? The apocalyptic imagination is one way of doing that. And so we do see in the studies I've been involved in over many years, we've noted a rise in the invocation of apocalyptic, satanic, or antichrist, or Dajjal figures in various traditions, even in traditions which typically they were a very muted, buried, hidden part of the traditional imagination. So they're on the rise, and they're not unconnected to this mundane political imaginary. Given these pressures and tendency, the pressures and tendencies on religious organizations, their increasing feeling of being a minority that was once a majority, of being displaced, of being threatened, of the loss, as we see in so many areas, certainly in the United States, the loss of adherents in dramatic numbers. Given all these pressures and tendencies, given the increasing skill of certain state leaders to manipulate religion to their own ends, what really deserves notice and further study are those religious leaders and communities which resist these trends in global religion, which refuse to become captive to the state or to the ethnic group or to the often brutal competition with other religions or with co-religionists. This is what deserves study, deeper study, that is. The resources brought to bear by the peace builders, by those who are resisting the trends toward nationalist violence, ethno-nationalist violence, and so on. These resistors seek to build peace. That says something, but not everything that needs to be said. They seek to avoid extremism, that is, violence for a sacred cause in the religious sense. They seek to avoid extremism as an end in itself. But they know, first, that they are usually outnumbered, outgunned, or at least outshouted by their belligerent co-religionists who have captured the state or have been captured by the state. So the resistors tend to seek allies outside the religion itself, sometimes including religious minorities within the territory, the region, the state. So, alongside violations against individuals and denominations, at least 630 church structures in Ukraine have been damaged or destroyed as of December 1st, 2023, according to data from the Institute for Religious Freedom in Kyiv. Occupied Donetsk and Luhansk are the cities with 146 and 83 church structures, respectively, are the cities with the highest number of affected churches, followed by now liberated Kherson, 78 churches destroyed, and then Kyiv, 73. The UOC, Ukraine's largest church, has suffered the most, with 187 damaged churches. Despite their minority status, evangelicals represent about 1/3 of the total, with 206 cases, Pentecostals with 94, and Baptists with 60. They have the most affected churches. Jehovah's Witnesses have an additional 110. Such violated religious bodies in time of war are often willing to join coalitions to protest, advocate, and sometimes revolt against the oppressor. These various religious communities have their own traditions of resistance, of prophecy, and they can be and are gathered in coalitions of the willing in an effort to counter violence and to build peace by various means. Other allies that the resistors, I'm calling them, face, other allies that they that come to their rescue, so to speak, or their aid, are the people I mentioned earlier. And this is professional peace builders and civil society actors who are trained mediators, educators, experts on peace settlements or on restorative justice after the fighting is over, and so on. I can't be with you in person today because I previously accepted an invitation to be here in Bogota and in Colombia more generally this week. And we're touring, and we're touring the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, which I oversee as Dean of the Keough School, has a project on peace accords and how to it has has been given the mandate to oversee the implementation of the peace accords, attempting to end the longest running civil war in the Western Hemisphere, the war in Colombia. So we are here examining, touring, learning about the coalition of peace builders throughout these regions in a nation of 500 million that's been devastated for decades by mass killings, rebel groups, civil war. It's a complicated situation. And it requires all hands on deck, and it requires a recognition that when the war ends, when there is some kind of settlement, say between Russia and Ukraine, that the structural divisions are so deep, the problems are structural, And they include, of course, the economy. They include movement across borders. They include religious and political and the like. And so religious actors are one often important player, but certainly not the only ones in this very complicated long-term science of building peace. Here in Colombia, we've heard repeatedly that the Catholic Church has more access to rebel territories and more mediating power than any other actor in civil society or in government in Colombia, because the church has accompanied and mediated. Now, this is a Catholic country, so everything's different and the dynamics change. The point is that there are different modes of religious peace building, but religions themselves seldom, especially a particular religion, cannot make much progress without coalitions of other religious actors, civil society actors, professionals from all points of the compass. The resistors know that they need other religious actors as partners. They know that they need professional peace builders, but they also know that peace accords, healing, reconciliation, and restoration, as I just said, are long-term processes, not amenable to a quick fix. So they steel themselves for the long haul. And sometimes they steel themselves literally. Religious peace builders, faith-inspired proponents of peace, are not pacifists. Very few of them are pacifists. They are nonviolent religious actors, but across the board, their nonviolence is supremely pragmatic. I don't want to say pragmatic more than principled, because nonviolence is a principled stand. But these peace builders want to rally their undecided co-religionists as well as other religious and secular allies, and they want to draw on the resources and sympathy of the international community and of their co-religionists across the world. So in that sense, they're quite pragmatic. They need to bring in as many partners as they can. And in another sense, which I'm about to give more detail on, they are pragmatic in response, ambivalently, to the role of violence, of violent resistance in these contexts. So let's take, for example, the statement issued to the world from Kyiv on February the 14th by the synods of bishops of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine. This shows that I wrote this talk since February the 14th, and that it is really hot off the presses news. So I'm glad I can say something in this talk that might be news to you folks. So let's take, for example, to illustrate this point about what does it mean to build peace. It's not kumbaya, it's not Pollyannish, it's principled, but also deeply pragmatic, coalition building, and recognizing stages and the longer view. So I'm just gave one example of this. A statement was issued to the world by the Synod of Bishops of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine on February the 14th. It was entitled, "The Message on War and Just Peace in the Context of New Ideologies." It's a 10,000-word document, which opens by signaling the intent to retrieve, and this is again back to my point about selective retrieval. All the traditions do it. They've always done it, but they are able to do it now, abetted by technology, various sharing of knowledge. They're able to retrieve doctrines and teachings and disseminate them very rapidly. So this document opens by signaling the intent that what we're going to do here in framing this statement is we're going to plumb the treasures of the Christian tradition in this case, and the long Christian tradition of theological and philosophical thought on peace and war. And we're going to, it says up front, we're going to shape them and interpret them in ways relevant to the current circumstances of our country, Ukraine. So this Synod of Bishops claims outright that building a just peace in Ukraine is a plausible goal, that is bringing this conflict to an end and some kind of rapprochement or at least mediation with Russia is a plausible goal. Despite Russian attempts to undermine freedom and to, quote, suppress Ukrainian culture, language, church, and identity for many years, Ukraine has developed, the bishops say, a strong civil society, quote, as evidenced by the Orange Revolution of 2004, the Revolution of Dignity of 2013, 2014, and the current heroic struggle against Russian aggression, close quote. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the bishops add, kind of putting their credentials on the table to issue such a statement, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is an integral part of that civil society, and therefore we cannot stand aside from its just aspirations, civil society's just aspirations, to have proper control over state power, build a fair democracy, and protect the rule of law and human dignity, close quote. The bishops seem to understand that peace building is a long and tortuous process, but it begins with evidence-based analysis of the conflict. And so the first half, roughly, of this message of 10,000 words goes into great detail, which you'd be familiar with right away, condemning in the strongest possible terms, quote, the hybrid totalitarianism of Putin's regime, by which they mean a melding of the state violence and overt fascism of the Soviet Union with 21st century surveillance, totalizing control mechanisms, which are, quote, superimposed on the colonizing legacy of imperial Tsarist Russia. Today, quote, this traditional Moscow imperial ideology has acquired a radical militant character and calls for the complete destruction of the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian identity as such. The war being waged by Russia against Ukraine has all the features of a neo-colonial war on the European continent with clear signs of genocide, close quote. So the bishops are not mincing words. In this context, they say the calls for any kind of compromise with Russia, quote, have no real basis and demonstrate a lack of understanding of the situation in which Ukrainians find themselves. Such calls, quote, disregard the principles of respect for human dignity and for a just peace, and there can be no peace without justice. Russia leaves Ukraine no choice but to defend itself militarily. This war is a national liberation struggle of the Ukrainian civilian nation for the right to its own existence and future, and the independence, freedom, and dignity of our citizens. This kind of language may not be unfamiliar, but I'm going to try to connect it to some of the themes I've struck earlier on religious agency. So the battlefield for these would-be Episcopal peace builders, these Catholic bishops, is peopled not only by soldiers, but by competing religious authorities. Quote, orthodoxy in its Moscow form, the bishops point out, is being used in Russia today to fill the ideological vacuum that arose because of the fall of communism. This is a natural evolution of the quote, long, one might say the centuries-long Russian Orthodox tradition of serving the Russian government in its various, sometimes opposing historical forms, from the Orthodox of the Tsardom of Moscow and the Russian Empire to the atheistic and communist Soviet Union. In all these state formations, the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church sought to be in unity with the political authorities and benefit from its privileged position, close quote. Indeed, the litany continues, the Moscow patriarch generated the new genocidal ideology, now known as the Russian world, and voluntarily offered its services, the services of the Russian Orthodox Church, to the criminal authorities of the Putin regime, and it sanctified these authorities. It is the Russian Orthodox Church that has given the Russian world ideology a quasi-religious spirit, portraying Russia as the last bastion of Christianity on earth that resists the forces of evil. That last sentence is a quote. So in this case of this statement, this message issued last month, the root of religious nationalism and extremism, the message makes clear that the problem here, the way religion and Christianity in particular has been distorted, is through attempts to make Christianity another ideology, to identify with a particular country, nation, or nations with their political ambitions and goals. Such instrumentalization, the bishops warned, contradict the very essence of Christianity. Quote, the whole world is now witnessing Russia's most brutal use of Christian symbols and gospel images to justify the violation of the international order, the attack on a sovereign state, and mass murder. The bishops call for Christians around the world to join, quote, numerous representatives of the Orthodox community itself in condemning the doctrine of the Russian world. These theologians, quote, denounce all those who affirm Caesaropapism, replacing total obedience to the crucified and risen Lord with obedience to any leader who is endowed with authority and claims to be God's anointed, regardless of the title he is known by, Caesar, emperor, king, or president. That's a very brief account of the first half of the document. I'll be briefer on the second half. The second half of the document identifies elements of a just peace. How do we become peace builders in a situation where we understand ourselves to be victims of completely unbridled and unjustifiable aggression? In Christian ethics, the bishops explain, quote, a just peace means more than just a victory over aggression or resistance against aggression. The ethics of just war, which they invoke and go on at some length about as the basis of modern international law, means the right of nations and people to independence. But here I'm going to conclude this review of this statement with two quotes. Number 52 in this statement. The purpose of legitimate defense of one's own people and statehood is to ensure a just peace for all parties. So revenge, conquest, economic gain, and subordination are unacceptable. A just peace can neither be the appeasement of the aggressor nor the so-called minimal peace that implies recognition of the territories occupied by the aggressor. Such a just peace must be long-lasting and permanent with the restoration of the principles of international law. It involves not only defeating the aggressor and restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity, but also measures aimed at restoring proper relations between Ukraine and Russia and healing the wounds caused by the war. Disclosure of the truth and recognition of criminals is required. International criminal courts must be at work. Reparations, political apologies and forgiveness, memorials, new constitutions, and local reconciliation forums. Of course, it's clear, that's the close quote. Of course, it's clear none of this will be easy. The bishops are very clear about that, and they recognize it's one step at a time sequentially. And they also recognize that any vision of building peace within Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, a peace that is sanctified, as it were, by the churches and by the religious bodies, not just this or that church, it will be impossible without a coordinated collective campaign. So paragraph 53 says, in order to achieve a just peace in Ukraine, Christian churches, international organizations, political institutions, and other religious bodies must be able to use very clear rhetoric to condemn Russia's military aggression and genocidal acts against Ukraine as a first step, and to ensure that war criminals are prosecuted. Unpunished evil continues to cause even more damage. That's enough on the Synod of Bishops statement of last month. And I know it has resonances with other such statements that have been issued over the last several weeks and months. But with this particular message in mind that I've just quoted extensively, let us celebrate the inherent ambivalence of religion in the face of aggression. Why would we celebrate the ambivalence? Because it holds possibilities. This ambivalence, this uncertainty about the proper response in a given situation in the light of God, that it opens up possibilities for intra-religious, interreligious, and religious secular dialogue and peace building that might not otherwise have been possible. One can talk of ambivalence, one can also talk of desperation and the recognition, the kind of shrewd political recognition that without this kind of interreligious, and religious secular collaboration, nothing's even vaguely possible. Religious actors who would be peace builders must be innovators and risk takers. Within the great tradition, whatever it may be, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, indigenous traditions, the internal diversity of historical conceptual responses to the sacred, the diversity of warrants for violence or nonviolence under specific circumstances, this is an opportunity for advocates of peacemaking to embrace and advance a vision of the religious community as a religion of peace. To say that it's a religion of peace is vacuous unless that content is filled in. What does that mean under these specific circumstances? And I take the Synod of Bishops' logic in this statement is saying this is why we're not recommending that we lay down our arms and hug our brothers and sisters. This is a brutal war of aggression, and it's going to require certain kind of very serious steps. Often this requires a measure of freedom within the religious community to excavate and reinterpret the tradition's rich, peace-related theological and ethical resources, and to question inherited and often reflexive patterns of resistance to forgiveness of injustices committed against the community and to reconciliation within enemies. We see time and time again, certainly in Ukraine and Russia, a kind of habitual almost religious response against forgiveness, against reconciliation. And often, as we know, religious actors and leaders can be those most intent upon revenge. In this context, the transnational movements that accompany globalization can push back with local religious actors against territorial canonicity to provide a peaceable alternative. The question here turns on whether Christianity or Islam, when displaced from their civilizational cradles and mobilized across territorial boundaries, can they bring to sites that are not historically sacred or canonical, as well to those that are, the confidence and sense of security that would be required to take the risk of innovation and hospitality incumbent upon the peace builder? That is to say, forming these coalitions with other religious actors and people you don't, and religions one might not ordinarily engage with, much less with secular actors or international actors, that requires a certain kind of confidence. It requires the risk of dialogue among the coalition, of innovation, of hospitality. The deterritorialization of religion, that quest, that attempt, has significant implications for the independence of religious institutions and officials and other actors from the state. Such relative autonomy from national interests in partisan political calculations may equip transnational religions to play a powerful mediating and reconciling role, including most transformatively those religions who are still notionally committed to a territorial homeland originally sacralized by the sacrifice of blood and treasure. From this perspective, is there hope for a plausible role for religion in reconciling Orthodox Christians as a step to peace? That Russia's war on Ukraine has been both resisted and justified by religious authorities of the Eastern Christian tradition, including rival Orthodox patriarchs who hold competing views of Holy Russia and the moral legitimacy of the war. That in itself is unremarkable. But what is really promising is the hope that other religious communities affected by the deadly conflict, Baptists, Pentecostals, Roman Catholics, Jews, Latter-day Saints, may also become more significant players in this drama. They can be forces for building peace. If the healing, restorative, reconciling power of religion is to become effective in the building of peace, however, it must first escape the distorting dynamics of a narrow territorial canonicity. Thank you all for listening. Happy to take questions and listen to you.
Thank you, Scott, very much for this wonderful presentation. It was mentioned in the beginning that you were an editor of this 5 volumes work on fundamentalism, and I wonder if you could connect fundamentalism with the war, if it does play any role in this war in Ukraine.
When we did the Fundamentalism Project study in the late 80s and into the mid 90s, we tried to be very careful to describe fundamentalism as a minority impulse within these larger religious traditions. That is, as a logic that is available to almost all religious traditions. And at that time, I was particularly worried not to. That project got criticized from both sides. You're being too soft on the fundamentalists. You're going after religion itself. We were glad to have criticism from both sides. We felt we were doing the right job if they didn't like us on either side. But the challenge was this religious logic that we called fundamentalism, or that had been called fundamentalism, and we just stuck with the term, that this religious logic was really a minority view within religions, a very powerful one because of modern technology and the fact that relatively few guerrilla or terrorist or whatever term we use can change the situation, can blow away decades of building peace and coalitions very quickly. The theme at the time, our attitude at the time was, these are minority movements within religions. I've been asked to look back however many years, that was 30 years ago, by Cambridge, a book I'm working on in Cambridge, what has changed? And at least for me, what has changed is, I think, not only my understanding, but I think the world has changed, that what we called then fundamentalism, for lack of a better term, that the religious logic there has become increasingly prevalent across the world, particularly the Russian invasion and its justifications are textbook for that logic. But again, it's not Russia or Ukraine alone, that this pattern seems to have been growing over the last 30 years and become more dominant as a response to the various pressures. That's why I say on religious traditions, that's why I say the question to really ask is, why haven't they all done this? Why haven't fundamentalism taken over these religious communities even more extensively? And so what is the logic? And again, the logic very quickly is that we found 5 ideological traits. We studied 18 clusters of movements around the world in those the studies were published in 5 volumes, 3,700 pages, a cast of 75 researchers around the world, experts in different religious traditions. And the last volume pulled these all together and tried to synthesize the findings. And the ideological traits were a reaction against the marginalization of religion, that so many of these, that they are reactive movements that began from a state of perceived weakness on their own part. And as I said in the talk, that their religious authority has been marginalized and has been marginalized not as an accident of history, but often as a conspiracy of the decadent West or whatever demonic forces out there against true religion, working against true religion. So reactivity. And then the reactivity takes place in the name of preserving the traditional religious precepts, beliefs, but actually it does more than anything to undermine those traditions, ironically, because it relies heavily on selective retrieval, the second trait of this religious logic, reactivity, selective retrieval. And we noted at the time that many of across these continents and traditions, the people who were in the kind of middle management of these movements they weren't astrophysicists or philosophers. They were engineers and software engineers, people who understand technical modernity. And so they tended to look at the scriptures and these sacred traditions as a blueprint or a toolkit, and they would rummage around those teachings and find the one that was most useful politically within the immanent frame, within this political calculation. And they would take that. They are anti-traditionalists because a traditionalist is governed by the complex, confusing, ambiguous, self-contradictory richness of these multi-generational texts and traditions. And the New Testament, Christ is said to have said, if you're not with me, you're against me. And a little bit later in Luke, if you're not against me, you're with me. Well, Lord, which is it? Make up your mind, get the story straight. These kinds of contradictions are in the Quran, they're in the Testaments, New Testament, etc. So engineers who are politically motivated are not comfortable with that kind of ambiguity. They're not patient with tradition, with wrestling with that angel of tradition. And so selective retrieval, reactivity, and then comes the kind of nastiness, the othering piece. And that is the traits ideologically of a sense that my position is the correct elect absolutist truth, a kind of Manichaeism, fifth, or dualism that, as I mentioned, we are the holy church and everyone who's not under our sovereignty is by that very fact, not only to be questioned, but to be cast into the other camp. And then the key piece is that we found in the ideological logic is this millennialism or apocalypticism, in which, again, selective retrieval of images and teachings that in most cases were never or seldom primary in the religious imagination have now become pronounced, because the more a religious leader can use as a recruiting tool and as a self-justifying tool for a movement that it might well do violence and sometimes indiscriminate violence against innocent non-combatants, the invocation of an apocalyptic cessation of ordinary time. We're moving into a special dispensation where all bets are off. Ordinary way of thinking is off. And then there's some organizational traits, which I'll spare you, but charismatic male leadership, certain kinds of pronounced religious garb that more or less says, my kippah is not just a regular kippah, it covers my whole big head, and that's because I'm a super Jew. So it's aggressive traditional garb, etc. In any case, when you look at the situation in Russia's aggression, it's hard not to find these ideological elements, and this is something that we see over and over again, a sense by aggressors that they are the victims. I had a very fascinating experience in the 90s and the 2000s, early 2000s, when I was able to meet a series of religious militants who had come to Washington to make their case. And these were Serbian Orthodox members of, they were different meetings, Hamas, Serbian Orthodox, Sri Lankan Buddhist, and there were 4 or 5 others, and we would meet for a day or two with each group and listen to them. And invariably, these were religious groups involved in a civil war or in a cross-border vicious, every one of them to a person, began, middle, and end, we are the victim. And if further they went back in history, they could say, at this moment, we're the victim. They would ignore all the other times when they were the victimizer. But they were the victim. Their victimization was more atrocious and outrageous. And when you point to all the things that the Serbian aggressors had done, they just didn't hear it. They just couldn't see it. It was a stunning psychological fact that we're the victims, and therefore we have to reassert, to react, and to retrieve certain kinds of religious teachings and images. But what we didn't find, as much as I think is the case now, is what was then called religious nationalism. That fundamentalism and religious nationalism have become ever more intertwined. That is, these religious reactions of the 80s and 90s have now become ever more embedded in the state, in a state that gives them comfort and support and assurance because they're feeling increasingly marginalized. And so the reliance on a powerful political authority. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, but yes, the answer is I see in the current situation in Ukraine and in Russia elements of what we would have called then fundamentalism, whatever term is appropriate today. I think it's fairly apt.
Well, I have a kind of the question al revés about the religious pacifism. And your point, if I'd like to go back to the point, non-violent is not pacifist. When I was writing about Ukrainian pacifism in times of war, I've been criticized by a number of Ukrainian scholars saying that my topic has no meaning and moreover it's kind of deeply immoral. Religious pacifism or any kind of pacifism in the context when the country is basically struggling for its own existence. I remember when the Gaza conflict occurred, the first message I received from my Ukrainian scholar and a colleague of mine on Facebook when she texted me, are you convinced now that religious pacifism ceased to exist? It's a kind of surprising that regardless that the roots of pacifism in pax, in Latin pax, peace, they are not associated with peace builders that you were talking about today. It's a kind of conventional understanding that you build peace after the war ends, but you don't build peace during the war. So the question is about impossibility or possibility of religious pacifism in the context of the whole-scale war.
So two quick responses. One is the distinction between pacifism, strict pacifism, and nonviolence. And my own training in a peace institute led me to think that for peace builders, in this case, people who are pacifism is a kind of a strict prohibition of any kind of violence. That pacifism is a witness to God's coming kingdom. If you use Christian terms, John Yoder, I knew him before he passed away, and I would say, how can you be a pacifist, a strict pacifist, if a robber breaks into your house and is threatening your wife and daughter, and you have the means to disable or kill that person, would you do it? And he said, no, but I'd want the police to do it. Well, okay. But his sense of pacifism was a witness to God's kingdom and to a kind of eschatological virtue, an end times virtue. And I take it for that. And I think it has a role in the religious imagination and in a religious community. That said, when we talk about peace building as I'm presenting it here, we're talking about a program that has to be as clearly high impact as religious aggression or religious extremism. That is, it cannot look at the tanks and the bombs and the guns as if they're going to go away, or as if the damage they can do to our families is somehow not real. I'm not suggesting, I don't want to mischaracterize pacifism, but nonviolence is a close cousin of pacifism. But Gandhi said, I'm a pacifist, but if I have to do violence, I will. Striking coming from Gandhi. Pacifism is better for all kinds of reasons, including what it does to your own spiritual. That as a form of protest is spiritually the most purifying. When you go into violence, Gandhi warned, things happen to you no matter what your intent. Point taken. But he said, if I have to do violence, I'll do violence because there are greater goods. And so it's within nonviolence that one can say, in my view, a responsible position in Ukraine, that in a struggle in Ukraine for resistance and against being completely overwhelmed and occupied, that nonviolence still argues against and prohibits. How is nonviolent resistance different than religious extremism, to use that term? The religious extremists believe they have a sacred duty, not just to commit violence, but to exterminate the enemy who is demonic or evil, wrong, kill them if you must. The nonviolent orientation is not that. The goal is not to destroy the enemy. The goal is, however, to resist the enemy effectively and to find ways of organizing, mobilizing nonviolently to bring violence to an end or to a halt. But it is a strategy within other strategies for resisting oppressors. There's much more to be said about this, but I think you might get less criticism If you spoke more about a nonviolent, that'll be controversial enough. It will be controversial enough in some settings to say, let's embrace strict nonviolence. That's not pacifism.
In the statement of the Synod of Bishops, elements tending towards genocide are mentioned. I don't remember the exact wording that you had.
It's a good question. I won't give you an adequate answer. If I had my colleague who's with me here now at the table with me, Jerry Powers, who is an expert on the Roman Catholic attitudes toward and response to the conventions on genocide, I think what he would say is that in what used to be called and still can be called mainstream global religious bodies, certainly Christian bodies, but especially Christian bodies, that the Convention on Genocide would be supported uncontroversially, could be invoked more effectively than it tends to be invoked. I'm not sure why it's the case that it's not invoked. And it may also be that there hasn't been sufficient amount of work done by experts on genocide or reaching out to certain religious communities to bring them on board in terms of giving the kind of civil society and religious density to those prohibitions.
While interpreting what the Russian Orthodox Church is doing in Ukraine, the Russian canonic territory of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state territory, because it seems to me that Kirill more sacralizes the Russian state territory rather than canonic territory. And this is completely different emphasis and focus, because instead of claiming that the Russian state protects the canonic territory of the Russian Orthodox Church, it's actually quite opposite. The Russian Orthodox Church supports the Russian state in protecting and sacralizing the Russian imperial territory, which means that the agency of the Russian Orthodox Church in this war, it's completely different. It's actually the state's utilization of the church to sacralize the territory. And that's why this famous preaching Kirill that Russian soldiers died in Ukraine, they sacrificed themselves for their fatherland, motherland, and that's why their sins will be washed out. But they sacrificed themselves for Russian state territory, not for the canonic territory of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly it's the case that Kirill is hand in glove with Putin's or with Russia's view of where its territory begins and ends. The question whether you go beyond that to a larger canonical territory that has been claimed religiously in the past. I guess I don't know enough about what Kirill himself has said. I guess in preparation for this lecture, in reading about him and about Church in Moscow more generally, it seems to be both, how do I put it? Again, this is from an outsider perspective, so it counts for very little, but it may be interesting to know what someone who's dipped a big toe into the water absorbs. Since at least 2019, if not earlier, between Putin and Kirill, Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church, a kind of a back and forth, that's not what it, but a symbiotic relationship in which the rhetoric and the extravagance of the rhetoric on both feeds off one another. And it's sometimes hard for an outsider to believe that rhetoric is limiting rhetoric. That is, what we're really concerned about is this territory, not the greater canonical territory. But again, that's just from an outsider's perspective, that the boundary, the border, or literal borders, metaphorical borders between those two conceptions seems to have been blurred as the warlike rhetoric on the part of Russia has just escalated. That would not be in the interest, one would think, of a realpolitik interest, certainly on the part of Putin, but he does a lot of things that don't seem to be in a realpolitik interest to me. Maybe what I should do is try to take a question I can answer. And here's one that I feel like I might be able to say something about. The talk touched on how technological processes have changed how religious messages can be quickly disseminated to a vast global network of adherents. What does this mean for the nature of religious authority in the 21st century? What factors contribute to whether a message is well received or rejected by a religious community? Is it simply the most vocal opinions that are heard, or do adherents still look for traditional models of authority? Do they still follow precedents, messaging, from what have historically been regarded as true religious authorities like the papacy, rabbis, Muslim sheikhs? Do these institutions still shape public discourses, or are they facing a real challenge from recent non-established actors simply because the latter holds more sway in the technosphere and new media? The answer to that either or question is yes. It's a good question. It's a very shrewd question. That is, both things are happening. It partly depends on who is the religious community we're talking about, who is the receiving public, including from messages from Kirill or Putin or others. Who's the intended audience, or who is the listening audience? In the case of studies show, it doesn't necessarily cut across generations. It's not, as one might expect, only the older Christians or Muslims or Jews who respect more traditional religious authority, and the younger ones who prefer non-established actors, as you say. It's a little more complicated than that, because you will have some younger religious actors who don't know very much about their tradition, gravitating toward quite conservative traditional religious leaders. And so there is a reinforcement of some segments of traditional religious leadership. Where traditional religious leadership has suffered, I think, is that younger people, younger generations who want to seek, are very committed to social justice, to liberation, to non-discrimination. They're not going to the more progressive religious leaders in their communities. They're abandoning the religious authorities because of their perception that they're bad on women's issues, or they're discriminatory against LGBTQ or whatever. So they don't gravitate as much to the balance of traditional religious, still traditional, but the priest in parish A or the priest in parish B, the priest in parish A is a traditional conservative, and he's going to be giving a message to younger people that, let me root you in a real tradition, let me give you a catechism, etc. They have a little bit more success than the priest in the moderate or liberal setting, who is trying to attract the socially justice-oriented. And many of them have already just left because, hey, you're still part of a hidebound institution. The fact of the matter is that both things are happening simultaneously. Or three things are happening: social media, self-appointed religious leaders, especially in fast-growing Pentecostal and evangelical and some Tablighi Jamaat religious movements. Those movements that are growing very rapidly depart in many important respects from traditional religious authorities' patterns, and they're growing. Whereas those that are more traditional, those who are more conservative traditional, are holding their own. There was a very important study many years ago called Why Conservative Churches Are Growing, and it was written in the 60s when religion was becoming cool and liberal. But the thesis there still holds today. Conservative churches are growing. The ones that are really hurting are my type of post-Vatican II Roman Catholics, who I have 4 children, and maybe 1.5 of them are anything like a practicing Catholic, and that's for my daughter kind of hangs on to the cultural symbol of Guadalupe. And any time Catholicism has a maternal religious imagination but she's pretty much disgusted with everything else. And the others, yeah, Dad, I know about Vatican II, I know about social teaching, I know about all the liberal stuff you do, but why are you still in the church? It's a sign of contradiction. So both are happening. There's a lot of shifting religious affiliation, and there's gravitation toward leaders who can kind of combine a message that is low on external authority structures, high on freedom, but also at the same time high on identity, that can be presented as deeply religious, deeply traditional. So it's a very shrewd, important question, and things are changing fairly rapidly on that front.
I'd like to thank you for, after a long day of work in Bogota, for sharing your time with us and for engaging in an analysis of this war and the role of religion within this war. We thank you for sharing your expertise, and we only wish you were here, but anyway, we wish you happy travels home, and join me in a round of applause.